What if the past was never as silent as we imagined? Not lost exactly, not erased completely, but scattered across old newspapers, ship logs, museum drawers, weathered maps, and excavation notes written by hands that did not always understand what they were holding. History often arrives to us polished and arranged like artifacts behind glass. But before it becomes a chapter in a textbook, it is usually something far more fragile. A blurred photograph, a field sketch, a strange object pulled from mud, a line of ink on brittle paper, a report filed and then forgotten. Tonight we follow 10 documented traces of ancient civilizations found where they were not expected to be. Some are firmly accepted by archaeology, some remain debated. Others reveal less about lost empires than about the human hunger to make sense of fragments. But each one shares the same quiet power. It asks us to look again. In archives, the past does not shout. It waits. It waits in cardboard boxes, in handwritten catalogs, in expedition journals, in black and white photographs, where faces stare toward us from another century. And sometimes, hidden in plain sight, a document changes the shape of a question. Not every mystery gives us an answer, but the best ones teach us humility. They remind us that civilization was never a straight road from darkness into light, but a vast human landscape of memory, movement, loss, invention, and rediscovery. So let us begin not with certainty, but with curiosity. Let us open the archive and listen for the distant voices still caught in the dust. Some mysteries begin in a place already larger than imagination. The Grand Canyon is a cathedral of stone, carved by water and time, its walls holding almost 2 billion years of Earth's memory. But in 1909, a newspaper story placed another kind of memory inside those walls. A report of hidden caverns, strange artifacts, and traces of an ancient people whose origins seemed impossible to explain. The article, published in an Arizona newspaper, described an alleged discovery connected to an explorer named G.E. Kincaid and said to involve the Smithsonian Institution. It spoke of chambers, relics, and symbols that seemed to point far beyond the American Southwest. Today, this story is treated with deep caution. No verified excavation records have confirmed the claims. The Smithsonian has denied knowledge of such a discovery, and serious researchers regard the article not as archaeological proof, but as an archival curiosity. And yet, that is precisely why it matters. The Grand Canyon account shows us how the boundary between document and evidence can become blurred. A newspaper clipping is real. The story inside it may not be. The ink exists, but the truth behind it remains uncertain. In a documentary journey about hidden civilizations, this is an important first lesson. Not every old document is a window. Some are mirrors, reflecting the fears, hopes, and imaginations of the age that produced them. The canyon remains silent. The article remains unresolved. And between them lies the first great question. When we find a document, are we discovering the past or discovering how people once dreamed about it? It began with a map drawn on gazelle skin, its lines faded but still alive with intention. In 1513, the Ottoman admiral Piri Reis compiled a world map from older charts, sailor reports, and geographic knowledge circulating across the Mediterranean. Only a fragment survives today, preserved in the Topkapi Palace archives in Istanbul. But that fragment has become one of the most discussed maps in historical cartography. At first glance, it seems to show the Atlantic world with surprising confidence. The western coasts of Europe and Africa, parts of South America, islands scattered like thoughts across the ocean. For some, it became a symbol of lost knowledge, perhaps even ancient mapping traditions reaching farther back than official history allowed. But careful scholarship gives us a more grounded and perhaps more interesting picture. The Piri Reis map belongs to an age of intense maritime exchange, when Portuguese, Spanish, Arab, Greek, and Ottoman sources moved through ports, libraries, in the hands of navigators. It does not prove an unknown advanced civilization. It proves something subtler. Knowledge travels. Maps are not merely drawings of land. They are records of contact, ambition, error, memory, and rumor. They show what people knew, what they guessed, and what they hoped might be true beyond the horizon. The mystery of the Piri Reis map is not that it breaks history. It is that it reveals history as more connected than we often imagine. A single sheet of skin carries the echo of sailors, empires, coastlines, and conversations now lost to the sea. Sometimes the document comes first, and the proof arrives centuries later. For generations, the Norse sagas told of voyages west of Greenland to a place called Vinland. These stories spoke of timber, new coastlines, encounters with indigenous peoples, and settlements beyond the known edge of the medieval European world. For a long time, many treated those accounts as legend. Beautiful, perhaps, culturally important, certainly, but difficult to prove. Then, in the 20th century, archaeological work at Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland changed the conversation. Beneath the grass and wind of the North Atlantic coast, researchers uncovered the remains of a Norse settlement, turf buildings, ironworking evidence, and artifacts consistent with Viking presence around 1,000 years ago. Here, the unexpected place was not mythical. It was real ground, cold and open, facing the same ocean the sagas remembered. The significance was not merely that Europeans had reached North America before Columbus. It was that oral tradition, written down long after the events it described, had preserved a geographic memory strong enough to guide modern discovery. Yet even here, humility is required. Lanceau Meadows does not prove every detail of every saga. It does not turn legend into literal history. It shows instead that stories can carry fragments of truth across centuries, if we are patient enough to test them against earth and stone. The past sometimes speaks in poetry before it speaks in evidence. And when the two meet, the silence between them becomes very small. Far to the north, civilization once clung to the edge of ice. The Norse settlements of Greenland were not hidden in a jungle or buried beneath desert sand. They stood in a landscape where survival itself was a document. Stone churches, farm ruins, animal bones, household objects, and written references preserved in medieval records. For centuries, these communities lived at the margin of the known world, trading walrus ivory, raising livestock, worshiping in small churches, and maintaining contact, however fragile, with Europe. Then gradually they faded. The unexpected part is not that humans reached Greenland. Human courage has always moved toward difficult horizons. The mystery lies in how a society could adapt for so long in such a demanding place, and then vanish from written history with so little explanation. Climate change, shifting trade routes, isolation, economic pressure, and relationships with Inuit communities have all been explored by researchers. The evidence remains complex. There is no single dramatic ending, no final written sentence that tells us exactly what happened. Instead, we have fragments, a bishopric mentioned in records, ruins standing in the wind, soil layers, bones, imported goods, a changing climate recorded in ice and sediment. Greenland reminds us that civilization is not only made of monuments, sometimes it is made of endurance. A community can be documented, real, and still deeply mysterious. And perhaps that is why these northern ruins feel so haunting. They do not ask whether people were there. They ask what it means for a way of life to slowly disappear while the stones remain. Beneath the water, time behaves differently. Off the coast of Greece lies Pavlopetri, one of the oldest known submerged towns in the world. Its streets, building foundations, tombs, and planned layout rest below the surface, preserved in a blue silence that turns architecture into memory. Unlike many underwater mysteries, Pavlopetri is not merely a rumor or a shape glimpsed in poor visibility. It has been surveyed, mapped, and studied by archaeologists. Its remains point to a Bronze Age settlement, a coastal community connected to trade, daily life, and the sea. What makes Pavlopetri so powerful is how ordinary it once was. There were houses here, paths, courtyards, burials. People moved through these spaces carrying food, tools, stories, and worries that would have been completely familiar to us. Then the sea advanced, or the land shifted, and the town entered another kind of history. Submerged cities challenge us because they disturb the stability of maps. We think of coastlines as permanent borders between human life and the unknown. But coastlines move, seas rise and fall, earthquakes alter harbors. A place that once held footsteps can become a place where fish pass through doorways. Pavlopetri is not evidence of a lost super-civilization. It is something more human and more moving. Proof that the world we inhabit is temporary and that whole communities can be displaced not only from land, but from memory. Underwater, stone does not forget. It waits for light to return. Some discoveries are difficult because they look almost too much like what we want them to be. Near Yonaguni, Japan, beneath strong currents and clear water, a massive underwater formation rises in terraces, angles, and broad stone plains. Since the late 20th century, divers, geologists, and researchers have debated whether these shapes are natural formations, human-modified structures, or something in between. The site is visually compelling. Steps appear to descend into the sea. Edges seem straight, surfaces seem arranged. For anyone drawn to the idea of drowned civilizations, Yonaguni feels like an invitation. But evidence must move more slowly than imagination. Some geologists argue that the formation can be explained by natural processes in the local sandstone, where fractures and erosion create sharp planes and block-like shapes. Others have suggested that humans may have altered parts of the site, though clear archaeological evidence remains limited. This is where the documentary record becomes important. Field reports, dive surveys, photographs, and geological assessments do exist. But they do not all point to one simple conclusion. Yonaguni is not a place where we can honestly say the matter is settled. It is a place where evidence and interpretation remain in tension, and that tension is valuable. It teaches us that mystery should not be rushed. A shape underwater is not automatically a temple. A natural formation is not less beautiful because it was made by geology rather than human hands. Perhaps the deeper question is not whether Yonaguni gives us the civilization we imagine, but whether we can look at an uncertain place without forcing it to become a story too quickly. In the desert, a line can become a message. Across the Nazca plain of Peru, enormous geoglyphs stretch over dry earth. Birds, animals, geometric forms, and long straight lines that can only be fully understood from above. They were not found in an impossible place exactly, but in a landscape so vast and quiet that their scale still feels improbable. The Nazca lines have been documented through aerial photography, archaeological surveys, and decades of research. They belong to ancient Andean cultures who shaped the desert surface by removing darker stones to reveal lighter ground beneath. Because they are so large, the lines have attracted speculation for generations. But the evidence points not to visitors from elsewhere, nor to impossible technology, but to human ritual, landscape knowledge, and social organization. Their purpose remains debated, with interpretations involving water, pilgrimage, astronomy, ceremonial pathways, and sacred geography. What makes Nazca profound is not that we cannot explain how the lines were made. We can. The greater mystery is why people devoted such care to marks that would outlast them by centuries. To make a figure in the desert is to speak to time differently. It is to create something that may be seen by one's ancestors, mountains, future humans, or perhaps no one at all. The Nazca lines remind us that civilization is not only practical, it is symbolic. People have always made meaning at scales larger than daily life. In a place of dryness and silence, they drew memory onto the earth itself. It began with a small clay jar, almost too ordinary to carry the weight placed upon it. In the 1930s, near Baghdad, archaeologists found objects that would later become famous under a name both simple and misleading. The Baghdad Battery. The assemblage included ceramic vessels, copper cylinders, and iron rods. Some researchers suggested they might have functioned as simple electrochemical cells. The possibility was fascinating. Could people in antiquity have known how to produce a small electric current? Could the device have been used for electroplating, ritual effects, or some unknown craft process? The evidence remains debated. The objects are real. Their interpretation is uncertain. Experiments have shown that similar arrangements can generate voltage under certain conditions. But whether ancient people used them that way is not firmly proven. Other explanations, including storage or ritual use, have also been proposed. The Baghdad Battery is important because it sits at the edge of what we mean by technology. We often imagine ancient invention as simple until modernity arrives. But ancient craftspeople were observant, patient, and highly skilled. They worked with metals, acids, pigments, heat, glass, and minerals in ways that required deep practical knowledge. Even if these objects were not batteries in the modern sense, They still point toward a world of experimentation we may not fully understand. Sometimes an artifact does not tell us what it was for. It tells us how much we have forgotten about the hands that made it. And that may be the more quietly profound discovery. A machine lay beneath the sea for 2,000 years, waiting for a century that could understand it. The Antikythera mechanism was recovered from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in the early 20th century. At first, it appeared as corroded bronze fragments, fragile and difficult to read, but inside those fragments were gears, not decorative gears, not simple pieces of metal, a complex arrangement capable of modeling astronomical cycles with astonishing sophistication. Over time, through X-ray imaging, careful reconstruction, and technical study, researchers came to understand the mechanism as an ancient Greek device for predicting celestial events, tracking cycles of the sun and moon, and possibly relating to calendars and athletic games. It remains one of the most remarkable technological artifacts ever discovered from antiquity. The Antikythera mechanism does not require exaggeration. Its documented reality is extraordinary enough. It shows that ancient scientific thought could become mechanical, that mathematical understanding could be translated into bronze, teeth, wheels, and motion. For many viewers, the surprise is not that Greeks studied the heavens. That is well known. The surprise is that such knowledge could be built into a portable instrument, then vanish so completely from the technological record that later generations would struggle to believe it existed. Here, the unexpected place was not only the shipwreck, it was the gap in our own expectations. The mechanism reminds us that history is not a ladder. Knowledge can rise, disappear, sleep under the sea, and return as a question centuries later. In the Amazon, the forest itself became an archive. For a long time, many outsiders imagined the pre-Columbian Amazon as a mostly untouched wilderness, too difficult to support large, complex societies. But archaeology, aerial imagery, soil studies, and landscape research have gradually changed that picture. Across parts of the Amazon basin, researchers have documented earthworks, roads, geometric enclosures, altered soils known as terra preta, and evidence of large-scale human management of forests. These findings do not describe one single lost civilization, but a diverse and sophisticated history of indigenous societies shaping the landscape over many centuries. The unexpected place was not the Amazon itself. Indigenous peoples have always known the forest as a lived world, rich with memory. The surprise belonged to outsiders who failed to see complexity because it did not look like stone pyramids or walled cities. This is one of the most important lessons in the entire archive. Civilization does not always announce itself in marble or towers. Sometimes it appears as dark, fertile soil, sometimes as tree distributions, raised fields, causeways, or patterns visible only when the forest canopy is studied from above. The Amazon evidence challenges not history, but the narrow definitions we have sometimes imposed upon it. It asks us to recognize forms of knowledge built through ecology, continuity, and restraint. Perhaps the most documented proof of an unexpected civilization is not a hidden palace at all. It is a landscape that was never empty, only misunderstood. Some documents survive because someone thought they mattered. Others survive by accident. A field notebook is placed in a drawer. A photograph is misfiled. A map fragment is preserved because it is beautiful, not because anyone fully understands it. An excavation report is printed in a small journal, read by a few specialists, then left to gather dust until a later generation asks a different question. This is why archives can feel almost alive. They do not simply store answers. They store unfinished conversations. Each document carries the assumptions of its time, what the observer noticed, what they ignored, what language they used, what theories shaped their eyes before they even began to look. The history of ancient civilizations is filled with such moments. Evidence may exist for decades before its meaning changes. A tool becomes a calendar. A ruin becomes a settlement. A legend becomes a lead. A forest becomes a human landscape. But the reverse is also true. A dramatic document may lose power when tested. A famous claim may shrink under evidence. A story that once seemed promising may become a cautionary tale. This is not failure. This is how knowledge matures. The past is not a locked room waiting for one perfect key. It is a long corridor of partial light, where each generation opens a few doors and closes others more gently. What matters is not believing every mystery. What matters is learning how to listen carefully when the evidence speaks in fragments. There is a reason these stories stay with us. They touch something deeper than curiosity. They remind us that human beings have always been moving, adapting, imagining, measuring, building, remembering. We have crossed seas in open boats, traced symbols into deserts, engineered devices from bronze, managed forests, settled cold coasts, and watched the stars with patient attention. The ancient world was not primitive in the way modern arrogance sometimes suggests. It was different. Its intelligence was shaped by different needs, materials, beliefs, and horizons. When we encounter an artifact in an unexpected place, we are not merely asking, how did this get here? We are also asking, what have we failed to understand about the people who came before us? That question can be uncomfortable. It asks us to loosen familiar timelines. It asks us to admit that absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. But it also asks us to remain disciplined, because wonder without care can turn history into fantasy. The best discoveries hold both feelings at once, awe and caution. They invite us to imagine then to verify, to be moved then to examine, to honor mystery without making it say more than it can. Across these 10 traces, from parchment maps to underwater towns, from controversial reports to carefully studied machines, one truth becomes clear. The past is not small. Our understanding of it is. And every document, every stone, every recovered object quietly asks us to expand it. So we return to the question with which we began. What if the history we were taught was only part of the truth? Not because someone hid the rest in darkness, not because the past was locked away from us by design, but because time is vast, evidence is fragile, and human understanding grows slowly, unevenly, through revision and rediscovery. Some of the records we explored are strong, some are disputed, some are less proof than provocation, reminders that a document alone is not enough. But together they show the strange beauty of historical inquiry. We are creatures of memory, always trying to reconstruct what came before from what remains. A rusted gear, a drowned street, a line in the desert, a saga written after the voyage, a soil darkened by generations of human care, a map that carries older maps inside it like ghosts. These fragments matter because they bring the ancient world closer. They make it human again. The people behind them were not symbols. They were navigators, builders, farmers, priests, metalworkers, storytellers, observers of tides and stars. They lived with uncertainty, just as we do. They left marks, not knowing who would find them. And perhaps that is the quiet promise of the archive. Nothing human is ever completely gone while someone is still willing to look, to question, and to remember with care. Which of these 10 documents speaks most clearly to you? Which one feels most unfinished? Leave your thoughts below and subscribe to Hidden Archive as we continue searching the forgotten rooms of history, where truth often waits not in thunder, but in dust, silence, and light.